Well, I would like also to thank Axelonet and the Institut für Sozialforschung for this invitation, this possibility to be here in a very important moment of the history of this institute and to be able to discuss with you. I would start with a paradox, as we were asked to do, and the paradox is the following. In the last 2 decades, we have seen a number of people who don't live in democratic states or who live in states which are not considered as fully democratic, making uprising for more democracy. And it means that this ideal, this normative ideal of democracy is appealing sufficiently to these people to risk even their life for it. But at the same time, we have seen uprisings, or at least huge protests in Western democracies, in all democracies, which have been characterized by the same way of mobilizing, the same distrust of the political elite, and also a reference to more democracy and a critique to the actually existing democracies. And I would like to try to make sense of this paradox. In order to make sense of this paradox, I think we have first to take some distance with the mainstream narrative on liberal or Western democracy. This could be illustrated by the famous book of Fukuyama after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Fukuyama wrote, "I argued that liberal democracies may constitute the endpoint of mankind's ideological evolution and the final form of human government, and as such, constituted the end of history. That is, while earlier forms of government were characterized by grave defects and irrationalities that led to their eventual collapse, liberal democracy was arguably free from such fundamental contradictions." As we know, it was not a good book, it was not a good philosophical book, but it was very successful because it could grasp the zeitgeist of these periods, the idea that ultimately liberal democracy were winning. 20 years or 30 years after this event, everybody can share the idea that the diagnostic was false. Even Fukuyama now said this. And we have seen the rise of authoritarian leadership in all democracies, the balance of the opening of the wall beyond Eastern Germany is not very satisfactory, and we have seen the rise of even neo-fascist leadership in a number of formerly democratic countries. So the mainstream liberal narrative now is a bit different from that from Fukuyama and says, well, the diagnostic was false, but we have to defend liberal democracies against this authoritarian trend. It was not the end of the story. Our adversaries are stronger than we thought, but still, we have the model that we want to defend. And my claim is that the problem was not only the diagnostic, but the underlying theory of history. What was this underlying theory of history? This was the idea that we, the Western people, are the front runners in one unique historical path. We have made regular progresses. We have to defend this achievement against pathological backlash. And for the other people, it means, as Indian colleagues have written, that Europe is both the norm and the exception. It is what the rest of the world must try to emulate, but never really can, with some exceptions. And I think that this narrative underestimates connections, hybridizations, inventions in the global south, and the fact that modernity has been multipled. And it was also a view for insiders. It forgets the dark side of Western modern liberty, wars, internal and external domination, social and ecological disasters. And I think that we need an alternative narrative. In fact, the mainstream narrative goes much beyond Fukuyama. It is a narrative we find in the most intellectual newspapers in Germany, France, or in the US. It is a narrative that most of my colleagues in political science or political philosophy defend. And we can see it with another political theorist, which is much deeper than Fukuyama, John Donne, perhaps the most important political theorist in the UK. And in his book, Setting the People Free, the story of democracy, the presentation is, democracy has come to define a system of government that marks a huge moral and political advance from any structure before it. Democracy has become the political core of the civilization that the West offers to the rest of the world. Setting the people free traces the roots of democracy from an improvised remedy to the local Greek difficulty 2,500 years ago, through its near extinction to its rebirth amid the struggles of the French Revolution. John Donne examined the differences and the extraordinary continuities that modern democratic states share with their Greek antecedents. So it's European, there is a continuity, not complete, but still a great continuity, and the bright side is the only one which is really analyzed. Against this narrative, I think that we have to stress that Western liberal democracy always had two faces. There was a paradox there has been a number of paradoxes in the history of our countries. The American founding fathers were white supremacists, which would be horrible in their affirmation of the white supremacy now. The development of male franchise in the 19th century was contemporary with the colonization of the rest of the world. Women were excluded from the new universalist conception of citizenship, especially in France. The first century of representative government was also the century of extreme unequal capitalism, and in the 20th century, as Hobsbawm has written, it was a century, the age of extreme. And the age of democracy was also the beginning of the Anthropocene era. Western democracies, in some way, invade the world with their CO2. We can see, for example, the responsibility of the West in the global warming. If you look at the cumulative emissions of CO2 since the beginning of the, say, pre-industrial era, the USA has produced a quarter of all the CO2 which contribute to the global warming. Germany has produced more than India. In fact, this way of life, the way of life of our democracies, the way of life which made it possible to have a global social consent to the political regime, was not universalizable. And what we see in France with the Yellow Jackets show also the difficulty of proposing an alternative way of development. And we could even say that from an historical point of view, the American way of life, both for America, but also as a model that fascinates the rest of the world, or at least the middle class in the rest of the world, is much more dangerous than the Islamic State or terrorism. So I think that we have to grasp the fact that till now, Western democracy had two faces, two sides, one bright one and one dark one, and that both have been equally true. One cannot forget the dark one, like Fukuyama or Dun, but one cannot deny the bright one, as some Marxists or some radical post-colonial thinkers pretend, because subaltern struggles have made reference to this bright side. And I think that this is a central political paradox of Western democracies. In fact, now we could say that the post-World War II era was more an historical parenthesis than a model. Perhaps the normality of representative government is not the power of the people, from the people, by the people, for the people, but the power of the elite, by the elite, for the elite. And there was an exception during a couple of decades after World War II, and I think that's a problem of the greatest political theories of the second half of the 20th century, is that they build their model as an ideal version of the really existing societies in the West, saying to Rawls or Habermas. And I think that this model, which was idealized in the political theory, implied a number of conditions: the social market economy, the welfare state, mass political parties, and a number of them are going on, are over the welfare state, partly at least, and mass political parties. They forgot that it remained an exclusive club, both in gender terms, but also in geographical terms. It was a model which was a model for a couple of countries, and the decolonization has been a disaster at this level. And I think that now we have to provincialize Europe, as the Indian scholar Chakrabarty has proposed, and we have to make this model part of some historical analysis. We think of Athens as a great example, but nobody would propose the Athenian model as it used to be as a solution for the 20th century, and I think that we have to do more or less the same with the model of the post-World War II version of democracy. I think that I disagree with you, although I agree with you on some other issues, that there is a crisis of liberal democracy which is huge and structural, and that the golden age is over, and that we have to imagine another model or other models. In this century, democracy is under stress. Take the evolution of political trust in the US. In the long run, it's declining, and you have the same evolution in most of the countries with formal democracy. For the first time in 2 centuries, the main economic power in this century will be a country which, at least till now, is not a formally democratic country. And I think that this is not only true there, this is not only a problem for a couple of years, but it is a result of the convergence of several crises which are analytically different, but which converge to the phenomena which we see now. The crisis of the welfare state democracy and neoliberal democracy, but till now without credible alternatives. The crisis of the ecological way of development we had since 2 centuries, which increasingly seem unsustainable. The crisis of the post-colonial order. Europe and the USA are being provincialized and have to build another identity in a geopolitical context, which is difficult. The crisis of democracy is also a crisis of the national states. Democracy was built within these national states, and now national states are only actors among others in the world order. And the social networks are both a dimension of the social change and a factor which make it quite quick. Think to the generation of the kids who now become adults, and think to the generation of their grandparents. Society has changed incredibly, and the political system has remained more or less the same, and the gap between the evolution of society and the stability, so-called stability, or the status quo of the political system is huge. And I think that we have, at least in Europe, to add another factor. Mass political parties are over. If you take the 50 more important political parties in Europe, they've lost half of their membership in 25 or 30 years, and their members are now far less active than they used to be. We have the decrease of big politics, to take a Max Weber notion, and we are in the era of small political games, from which Macron, perhaps, is a good example. I think that we need a new democracy for this century. History has no endpoint. Democracy has to change, changes always, and a democracy which doesn't change is dying. It's interesting to see that the two most visible proposals of the so-called Yellow Jackets in France, in addition to their claim for more horizontal forms of mobilizations, have been citizen initiative, Bürgerbegehren and Bürgerentscheid, and a citizen assembly selected by lot among citizens in order to defend citizens' rights beyond electoral democracy. I think that this is revealing that the status quo, the political status quo, is no more an option, and that perhaps competitive party democracy is no more central to the legitimacy of the political elite. It is part of it, for sure, but it is only part of it and no more central. Take another example, the checks and balance. The classical view, we know all of it, the difference between legislative, executive, and judicial. It's still important. If we would live in a country like, say, Hungary, we would defend this division of power and these checks and balances. But I think that in the world order, this old constitutional vision of the checks and balances is outdated. In fact, global governance can be represented like our colleagues who work on social networks represent a social network. A network which is horizontal, but which is not equal. You have people who are much more visible than others, who are much more influenced than others, and if you Google, you would find 10 websites, and you will not see hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of websites. And I think that the global governance at world level is like this picture of a social network. At the center, you have strong actors like the US government, the Chinese government, the World Bank, perhaps the United Nations. But after, you have also big companies like Google, Facebook, Alibaba, and so on. A bit more at the periphery, you have the German or the French government, you have agencies of the United Nations, perhaps you have Greenpeace, perhaps you have the Federation of Unions, and more at the periphery, even you have small governments, you have smaller companies, you have most of the biggest NGOs, and so on. And the problem is to make a new check and balance between these actors, which do not only influence the norm which are compelling for all of us, but who are directly producing a part of these norms. Yet, the idea of the normative paradoxes, at least as I understand it, is that it is not static and that these paradoxes are productive, that they can lead to improvements, that the contradiction is not a dilemma, but something which can make it possible to have a better world. And in front of the huge resistances that the global world order opposes to any change towards a more just and more democratic society, both at national and world level, we could think that we need a new democratic revolution, from the storming of La Bastille to the yellow jackets in Paris at the beginning of December. But actually, only a few people want a revolution, a kind of revolution, which would be similar to the storming of La Bastille or the fall of the Winter Palace. And people demonstrated in Paris were ready to act violently, and the majority of French people did understand this, but they didn't want to make a revolution. But perhaps if we think to the concept of revolution in another way, a way which is not built after the model of the storming of La Bastille, but which is built resting on the model of the feminist revolution, then perhaps the picture looks different. The feminist revolution, which is not over, but which is very important and strong has been strong in the last, say, 5 decades, is a revolution, perhaps one of the most important revolutions in the history of mankind. It has not been a war, it has not been an electoral success of one party, it did not rest on one charismatic leadership. It has been a revolution with actors active in the streets, in the families, in the universities, in the culture, in the government also, in the courts. And if you look to Me Too, it's a movement coming from the social networks, but it doesn't stop with the social networks. It's also implied courts, legislation, and so on. And if we think to the revolution in that way, perhaps the normative contradiction or the normative paradox from which I spoke at the beginning of my talk could be productive and could lead to the invention of new democratic models, both in the West and in the global South. Thank you.